John Blackstar, astronaut, is swept through a black hole into an ancient alien universe. Trapped on the planet Sagar, Blackstar is rescued by the tiny Trobit people. In turn, he joins their fight for freedom against the cruel overlord, who rules by the might of the Power Star. The Power Star is split into the Power Sword, and so, with Star Sword in hand, Blackstar, together with his allies, sets out to save the planet Sagar. This is his destiny. I am John Blackstar.
Remember Saturday mornings in 1981? You'd pour yourself a massive bowl of sugary cereal, plop down 2 feet from the TV, and get ready for some serious cartoon action. But here's the thing. There was this one show that basically invented He-Man before He-Man even existed, and almost nobody remembers it today. I'm talking about Blackstar. And if you're sitting there thinking, wait, wasn't that just a cheap He-Man knockoff? You've got it completely backwards. See, Blackstar came first. It was the blueprint, the prototype, the secret weapon that Filmation used to figure out how to print money with Masters of the Universe 2 years later. But here's what's wild. Despite being the foundation for one of the biggest toy franchises in history, Blackstar only lasted 13 episodes. Just a measly 13. And then it just vanished. So why did a show that had everything going for it, sword and sorcery action, a diverse cast, groundbreaking animation techniques, and a toy line, completely disappear while He-Man became a cultural phenomenon worth billions? Well, buckle up, because the story behind Blackstar is way more interesting than the show itself. We're talking network racism, blue smurfs, and one of the most blatant cases of anime plagiarism you've ever seen. So let me take you back to 1981, when Saturday morning TV was about to change forever. Point 1. The vision that almost was. Alright, so let's set the stage. It's 1980, and Filmation Associates is on a mission. Lou Scheimer and Norm Prescott, the guys running the studio, they're looking at what's happening on Saturday morning TV, and they're seeing nothing but Scooby-Doo clones and Hanna-Barbera slapstick. But Scheimer? He's got bigger ambitions. He wants to do sword and sorcery. He wants Edgar Rice Burroughs meets Frank Frazetta. He wants to create something that feels epic. Something with stakes. Something that makes kids feel like they're watching a real adventure. So they greenlight Blackstar. And here's where it gets interesting. The original pitch was genuinely groundbreaking for 1981. The premise? John Blackstar is a NASA astronaut from the future who gets sucked through a black hole and crash lands on an alien planet called Sagar. It's this weird mix of high-tech sci-fi and medieval fantasy. You've got photon-based spaceships existing alongside magic swords and dragon horses. It's basically John Carter of Mars, but for the Saturday morning crowd. And here's the kicker. Lou Scheimer's original vision was to make the lead character black, an African-American hero leading a Saturday morning action show in 1981. Do you understand how radical that would have been? But then, CBS stepped in. The network executives literally told Filmation that the American television audience was not yet ready for a black protagonist in an action-adventure role. I'm not paraphrasing. That's what happened. In 1981. So they forced them to redesign the character to have what they called an ambiguous racial background. Most people interpreted him as Native American or Latino, which, look, representation is representation. But it's not what Scheimer wanted. And you know what's crazy? This decision would haunt Filmation. Because 6 years later, they finally got to do what they wanted with Bravestar, an explicitly Native American lead character. But by then, the moment had passed. Now, let's talk about the actual show they made. The central conflict revolves around this weapon called the Power Star. At some point in Sagar's ancient history, this all-powerful magical artifact got split in half. Blackstar has one half, the Star Sword. The villain, a Ming the Merciless type dictator called the Overlord, has the other half, the Power Sword. And the Star Sword? This thing is ridiculous. It can absorb any form of energy, store it, reflect it back, and it generates an invisible protective aura that gives Blackstar superhuman strength, speed, and invulnerability. It's basically a lightsaber, a shield generator, and a power ring all rolled into one. Blackstar's got this whole crew helping him out. There's Mara, the centuries-old enchantress with telepathic and telekinetic powers. There's Clone, a tall, green shape-shifting elf who provides comic relief. And then there are the Trobits. And oh man, we need to talk about the Trobits. Point 2. The Trobit disaster. So originally, these little sidekick characters were going to be called Trollkins, and they were going to be blue. Makes sense, right? Trolls are usually depicted as blue or green in fantasy stuff. But then Filmation discovered 2 problems. Problem number 1. Hanna-Barbera was already producing a show called Trollkins. Okay, fine. We'll change the name. Problem number 2, and this is the big one. The Smurfs had just premiered on NBC and were absolutely dominating Saturday morning. Like, crushing everything in their path. Blue was taken. Blue was Smurf territory. If you put blue characters on screen in 1981, kids were just going to think discount Smurfs. So Filmation made a desperate pivot. They renamed them Trobits, which, let's be honest, is just hobbits with a TR in front, and they made them magenta pink. Now, I want you to imagine you're a toy executive in 1983, and someone shows you action figures of magenta pink tree-dwelling creatures named things like Balkar, and Riff, and Gossamer. You're going to pass, right? But here's the thing. The Trobits were actually kind of cool in the show. Each one had a specialized skill. Balkar was the king and an alchemist. Riff was the cook who also did pyrotechnics. Terra was the gardener. Karpa was the carpenter. They were like a little fantasy A-team. The problem was, they looked ridiculous. And when the toy line finally came out in 1983, 2 years after the show was canceled, kids took one look at these magenta creatures and went, "What?" But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before Blackstar could fail as a toy line, it had to fail as a TV show. And that failure, that's where the story gets really interesting. Point 3. The censorship nightmare. Alright, so you'd think the biggest challenge facing Blackstar would be the animation costs, or the competition from other shows, right? Wrong. The biggest enemy Blackstar faced was CBS standards and practices. These were the network censors, and in the early 80s, they were terrified of violence on children's television. There'd been all these congressional hearings about TV violence, and networks were overcompensating like crazy. Let me give you an example of how insane this got. There's an episode called Search for the Starzord, where Blackstar fights these creatures called lava locks. They're giant stone golems, not alive, not sentient, just animated rock formations. Blackstar smashes one with his sword. CBS sent a memo saying this was unacceptable because it demonstrated intent to do harm. Let me repeat that. The network objected to the hero smashing a non-living rock monster because it showed intent to do harm. The standards and practices executives suggested that instead of Blackstar destroying the lava lock, maybe one of the tiny Trobits could accidentally bump into a boulder, which would then roll down and coincidentally destroy the monster. I want you to picture this. You're watching an action-adventure show. The hero is facing a giant stone monster, and instead of fighting it, a 3-foot-tall magenta creature trips and knocks over a rock, which defeats the villain. That's what CBS wanted. The Filmation writers were losing their minds. They're trying to make an exciting sword and sorcery show, and the network is micromanaging every single punch, every sword swing, every moment of conflict. And this wasn't just Blackstar. This was happening across all action cartoons. But it hit Blackstar especially hard because the entire premise of the show was built around this epic conflict between Blackstar and the Overlord. You can't have an epic conflict if your hero isn't allowed to demonstrate intent to do harm. So the writers had to get creative. They'd have Blackstar use his sword to reflect energy back at enemies. That's not intent to harm, that's self-defense. They'd have the Overlord's own traps backfire on him. Not Blackstar's fault. They'd have environmental hazards do the work. Hey, that lava pit was already there. It was exhausting. And it sucked the energy out of what should have been thrilling action sequences. But you know what? The show still worked. Despite all the restrictions, despite the censorship, despite everything working against it, Blackstar managed to tell compelling stories. And then the Smurfs destroyed everything. Point 4. The Blue Menace. It's September 12th, 1981. Blackstar premieres on CBS. That same morning, NBC debuts The Smurfs. And it's not even close. The Smurfs absolutely obliterate the competition. We're talking ratings dominance on a level that Saturday morning hadn't seen in years. Kids are obsessed. Parents love them because they're non-violent. NBC is printing money. And Blackstar? Blackstar is getting respectable numbers, but it's not breaking through. It's not capturing the cultural zeitgeist. It's just there. Now, here's the thing. Blackstar was never going to beat the Smurfs. Actually, nobody was going to beat the Smurfs in 1981. But that's not why the show got canceled. The show got canceled because CBS only ordered 13 episodes. 13. In the 80s, if you wanted a show to succeed in syndication, you needed at least 65 episodes. That's a full weekday rotation for 3 months. 13 episodes? That's nothing. That's barely enough to establish your characters, let alone build a franchise. Lou Scheimer later said that network policies had shifted towards shorter episode orders because they were less risky. If a show flopped, you weren't stuck with 65 episodes of dead inventory. But it also meant that shows didn't have time to find their audience. Blackstar ran from September to December 1981. 13 weeks. And then it was gone. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1983, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe premieres. It's a massive hit. Kids are going crazy for it. Mattel is selling millions of dollars worth of toys. And suddenly, local TV stations are looking for more content like He-Man, and so they find Blackstar. The show goes into syndication, and it actually does pretty well. Kids who loved He-Man are discovering this earlier Filmation show with a similar vibe, and they're eating it up. The reruns are getting solid ratings, but Filmation never made more episodes. They'd moved on. The moment had passed. And that's the tragedy of Blackstar. It found its audience 2 years too late. Point 5. The He-Man connection. Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. How much did Blackstar influence He-Man? The answer is basically everything. Filmation literally used Blackstar as a training ground for Masters of the Universe. They refined their rotoscoping techniques. They figured out their stock footage library. They learned how to write sword and sorcery for a Saturday morning audience. But it goes deeper than that. The core concept of He-Man, two halves of a powerful sword that need to be reunited, that was originally pitched for Blackstar. The Power Star was supposed to be the weapon, the ultimate prize. When Mattel was developing the He-Man toy line, the original concept was that He-Man and Skeletor each held half of the Power Sword. Visual transitions? That sword-swiping screen wipe that's iconic in He-Man? Developed for Blackstar first. Character designs? Warlock, Blackstar's dragon horse mount, was literally reused as a creature in a He-Man episode. Animation historians have found cells of Warlock that still have the MU production code, Masters of the Universe, on them. Voice actors? Alan Oppenheimer voiced the Overlord in Blackstar. He then voiced Skeletor in He-Man. Same guy, similar character, similar voice. The Sorceress? That's basically Mara with a different outfit. Filmation took everything they learned from Blackstar. The good, the bad, the stuff that worked, the stuff that didn't. And they poured it into He-Man. And because Mattel was backing He-Man with a massive toy line and marketing budget, it exploded. Blackstar was the prototype. He-Man was the finished product. And you know what's really wild? If CBS had given Blackstar a full 65-episode order, if they'd supported it with better marketing, if they'd launched the toy line in 1981 instead of 1983, we might be talking about Blackstar as the franchise that defined the 80s. But they didn't, and it wasn't. Point 6. The toy line, that time, forgot. So let's talk about those toys, because this is where things get really weird. Galoob licensed Blackstar in 1983, 2 years after the show was canceled, because they saw He-Man making a fortune and thought, hey, we've got a similar property just sitting here. And to their credit, they actually made some really cool toys. The figures had this feature called laser light, where there was a flint and striker mechanism in the chest. You'd turn a wheel on the figure's back, it would strike the flint, and actual sparks would light up a translucent jewel on the chest. In 1983, this was revolutionary. These toys had actual fire inside them. The sculpting was great. The packaging art, done by this artist named David B. Mattingly, was gorgeous. Dark, atmospheric, way more mature than the typical toy line art of the era. But there was one problem. Actually, there were several problems, but let me focus on the big one. The Blackstar spaceship. This was supposed to be the ship that Blackstar used to travel to Sagar. Cool concept, right? Every action figure line needs a vehicle. Except Galoob just straight up stole the design from Mobile Suit Gundam. I'm not talking inspired by or similar to. I'm talking they took the core fighter from the 1979 anime and just copied it. Same triangular fuselage, same wing configuration, same everything. Now, in 1983, most American kids had never seen Gundam. Anime wasn't really a thing in the US yet, so Galoob probably thought they could get away with it. But they were literally selling a Japanese mecha fighter as a fantasy spaceship, and nobody at the company apparently thought this was a problem. There's no record of Sunrise, the Gundam creators, taking legal action, probably because the Blackstar toy line was so small, it wasn't worth the legal fees. But it's a perfect example of the kind of corner cutting that happened in the 80s toy industry. The toy line ran from 1983 to 1985. It sold okay, not great, not terrible. Today, mint-in-box Blackstar figures with working laser light mechanisms are actually pretty valuable to collectors, mostly because so few survived. But here's the sad part. If the toy line had launched in 1981 alongside the show, with proper marketing support, it might have been He-Man before He-Man was He-Man. Instead, it was just another forgotten toy line from the 80s. The legacy. So what's the legacy of Blackstar? On the surface, it's a show that lasted 13 episodes, got decent ratings, spawned a mediocre toy line, and then disappeared into the mists of Saturday morning history. But that's not the real story. The real story is that Blackstar was the foundation for one of the biggest entertainment franchises of the 1980s. Every technique Filmation developed for Blackstar, the rotoscoping, the stock footage, the three-voice rule, the sword and sorcery storytelling, all of it got refined and perfected for He-Man. The real story is that Lou Scheimer tried to put a black hero on Saturday morning television in 1981, and the network shut him down because they didn't think America was ready. And you know what? They were probably right about the network executives and advertisers. But the kids would have been fine with it. The real story is that sometimes the prototype is more interesting than the finished product. He-Man was more successful, sure. But Blackstar was weirder, more ambitious, more willing to take risks. And honestly, for those who remember waking up early on Saturday mornings, pouring that bowl of cereal, and watching John Blackstar swing that Starzord at the Overlord's forces, it was pretty damn cool. The show deserved better than 13 episodes. It deserved better than a network that was terrified of its own shadow. It deserved better than being remembered as that show that came before He-Man. So here's to Blackstar, the show that could have changed everything. The prototype that paved the way. The forgotten gem of Saturday morning television. Now, if you want to see how Filmation took everything they learned from Blackstar and turned it into a billion-dollar franchise, check out my video on the complete history of He-Man right here. Once you see the connection, you'll never look at Masters of the Universe the same way again. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.